Well, good afternoon. Welcome to a session that I have been looking forward to.
That was pretty sorry here. Come on.
Good afternoon. There we have it.
I feel like I'm in the military here.
General George W. Casey Jr. served a 41-year career in the United States Army following his graduation from Georgetown University. He's an accomplished leader and an authority on strategic leadership. He served as the Chief of Staff of the United States Army from 2007 to 2011 and is widely credited with restoring balance to a war-weary Army and leading the transformation to keep it relevant in the 21st century. He is a stalwart advocate for military families, wounded soldiers, and survivors of the fallen, and he took on the tough issues of suicide and reducing the stigma associated with combat stress. In addition, the General commanded the multinational force in Iraq, a coalition of more than 30 countries, where he guided the Iraq mission through its toughest days. In his 15 years as a general officer, he held numerous senior leadership positions in Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. General Casey is currently lecturing on leadership at the S.C. Johnson College of Business at Cornell University, at other business schools, and to the leaders of national and multinational corporations. He also lectures on international relations at the Corbell School at the University of Denver. He's also the chairman of the USO Board of Governors, on the board of Georgetown University, on corporate boards, and on several other boards of organizations that support our service personnel, our veterans, and their families. Please give a warm welcome to General Casey.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I don't say I retired, I say I entered the private sector. It's great to be down here with you. I always love being in the military audience, and I honestly don't get much of a chance to talk to military audiences very much anymore, so it's a real treat. And I always got to start off with a kind of a joint joke, because it's kind of a joint audience. And so there's a Air Force pilot, an Army general, and a Marine sergeant major, and they're all in a prisoner of war camp. And one day the commandant comes in and says, well, I have some bad news. Tomorrow at dawn, you're all going to face the firing squad, but I'm here to grant you your last request. And so he goes up to the Air Force pilot and says, Major, what's your last request? And the major throws his scarf over his shoulder and says, I would like to have my last meal by candlelight with a beautiful woman. He said, it will be done. He goes up to the Army general, who sucks himself up to his full height of 5'9", and says, General, what's your last request? He says, I'd like to address the troops one more time. He says, it will be done. And he walks over to the sergeant major and says, Sergeant Major, what's your last request? And he says, I'd like to be shot an hour before the general starts talking. So hopefully, when I'm done with this, you won't feel the same way. One of the things people always ask me is, what's it like going from being in charge of an organization of 1 million people with a staff of hundreds at your beck and call, with a G5 that will whisk you all over the world at your beck and call, to being really just an army of one, you and your iPhone, because that's what it is. And honestly, I had trouble articulating what it was like to people until one day, a couple years ago before Thanksgiving, I was doing a crossword puzzle. And I'm going along, and the clue is Army head, 7 letters. I go, easy, general, boom, move on. So I'm going on and doing the puzzle, and you know how when you're doing a puzzle you realize something's not working? And finally I realized it wasn't Army head, it was Army head, and the answer wasn't generals, it was latrine. So that's kind of what it's like, going from general to the latrine. But one of the things they tell you when you leave is you have to keep your mind engaged. And what they tell you is figure out what you really love to do and then figure out how to do it. Well, what I realized after about a year or so was that what I really loved to do was talking to young people about leadership. And that's what I do up at Cornell in the business school. That's what I do with these multinational businesses, and some of the people aren't so young. But I believe over the course of my career, and especially in Iraq, I saw that effective leadership makes the difference. And the title of this talk today is Leading in a VUCA World, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. That's your world. whether you like it or not. And it's different than the world that I served 40 years in. And it's the one that you all are going to have to lead in. And so what I was like to do this afternoon for about 30 minutes, I'll take about 30 and then I'll leave about 15 for questions, is to try to give you just a couple of insights that might help you on your leadership journey. Because in reality, you're really just starting out on your journey. Even though you're at your third really level of military school here, you've got your command experiences and the War College coming up. And I can tell you, I probably grew more after Lieutenant Colonel level command than I did before it, even though I grew an awful lot during that time. So this is a journey. And none of it's easy. And if I say anything glibly that makes you think that I kicked it in the ass and it was easy, it doesn't work like that. Everybody has their ups and downs. And I forget who said it, probably maybe everything gets attributed to Churchill, but it's not the failing, it's the failing to get up and fix it. That's where the problem is. So anyway, I'm going to share some thoughts with you specifically about leading in this VUCA world. So, VUCA. Honestly, I came across VUCA probably 30 years ago, and I'd forgotten about it. And it didn't really re-enter my mind, and I didn't really start thinking about it in those terms until one day, it was just several months after I retired, I got a call from the dean of the Keenan Flagler Business School at University of North Carolina. And she said, "General, would you come down and talk to us about leading in a VUCA world?" I said, "Absolutely, Dean, no problem, be there." And I hung up and I immediately Googled VUCA. And imagine my surprise when I found it was a term that was coined by the United States Army War College in the late 80s, early 90s, to talk about what they thought the world would be like in the aftermath of the demise of the Soviet Union. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And as I was preparing for the talk, I realized that I'd seen VUCA. I saw it in Bosnia in '96, I saw it in Kosovo in 2000, and I saw it in spades in Iraq in 2004. And leading only got harder. And I think, and that's what we're faced with now. And I'll talk to you just to give you an example about how VUCA it was, and I'll use just an example of my first 30 days in Iraq. I was sitting in there with Ambassador John Negroponte on the 1st of July, 2004. It was 3 days after the new Iraqi government had been seated. It was 15 months after we had gone in there, and the ambassador and I were told to go in and form a partnership with the new Iraqi government, people who we had never met, build a plan for the United States to succeed. And oh, by the way, I had to stand up my headquarters that was just partially getting organized. And we had to do that while keeping a difficult uncertainty at bay. So we walked into this, and our plate was full. Our eyes were rolling back in our heads. It was really something. And then right in the middle of all this, we get thrust into a major countrywide battle because a young Marine who'd been on the ground less than a week made a wrong turn, drove too close to Muqtada Sadr's house. A gunfight broke out that quickly spread around the holy city of Najaf, and then across the whole southern part of the country. Something well outside of our control had impacted us at a very inopportune time. That's volatility. Uncertainty. Anybody here? How many of y'all, raise your hand, how many of y'all here can predict the future? Thank you. We all acknowledge that, right? We know we cannot predict the future. Yet every time we produce a plan, we think it's going to work. And we get disappointed when it doesn't work, right? The outcomes are always going to be uncertain. You're never going to know where that road will take you. When the ambassador and I walked into Iraq, as I said, we were given 30 days. We had an Iraqi government that was 3 days old. We had 3 battalions in the Iraqi army. We had 162,000 troops from 33 countries who were participating in a form of warfare that none of us had participated in since Vietnam. And there were precious few people with any Vietnam experience still around. I'm telling you, in those early days, the outcome was extremely uncertain. Complexity. Iraq was the most complex environment I'd ever seen. In every decision I had to make, I had to take into consideration what the U.S. government wanted, what the Iraqi government wanted, what the governments of the 33 countries that were providing troops to the coalition wanted, what the various Iraqi factions wanted, and that was just the good guys. The enemy had a vote, and the enemy wasn't just good guys, it wasn't just bad guys. It was terrorists, it was insurgents, it was militia, it was common criminals. I mean, it was mind-boggling. And any time I made a decision, somebody was unhappy, guaranteed. That's complexity. And I had to deal with multiple competing internal and external variables. And lastly, ambiguity. The same differing interpretations from the same event or data. Now you can imagine in a multicultural environment like we were operating in, that we wouldn't all necessarily agree that this event meant this or this piece of information meant that. In fact, I don't know that we ever agreed with the Iraqis on what something meant. And it just made things a lot more difficult and a lot more complex. So as I thought about that, as I was preparing for this talk, I started saying to myself, okay, well, what's the impact of that on leaders? What's the impact of volatility on leaders? What's the impact of uncertainty on leaders? Etc. So what is the impact of volatility on leaders? Here's what I saw. And I'm talking about now War College graduates, lieutenant colonels, colonels, generals, right? Really good folks. All right? And here's what happened. Some people, when things kept changing, what did they say? Why the heck should we plan? Right? Well, every time we devote all this effort to making a plan, it doesn't work, it changes. So why don't we just react to what the enemy does? And I thought that might just be a military thing until I had the CEO of a multinational corporation say the same thing to me. We devoted all this time to planning, and it never works. We always have to change it. You have to watch that. So what do you do about that? What do you do when things constantly change to be successful in this environment? What I found that you have to do is you have to treat every bad thing as an opportunity. Think back to Najaf. So we're inside of 30 days in Iraq. We got this major battle going on throughout the whole southern part of the country. And I looked at this and I said, we must restore Iraqi government control to Najaf. Najaf is the third holiest site in Islam. And so we had to restore Iraqi government control to this in the first month that they are in the job. And that's what I said. And in 30 days, we had done that. So I tried to treat a challenge as an opportunity. And to do that, you need an offensive mindset. You've got to be out there constantly looking for the opportunities. You have to be opportunistic to succeed today. Uncertainty. What's the impact of uncertainty on leaders? Right? Hesitation, inaction, right? If you're uncertain about something, you're not going to decide, right? You get on the back foot. I saw really good leaders not act because they were afraid of making a mistake. We're all afraid of making mistakes. Everybody has doubts. If you don't have doubts, you're not playing in the same league as everybody else. But you have to act. So what do you do? I mean, you don't just act capriciously. What I found was that we had to set our own objectives and then work toward them. And we had to set our own success and then make it happen. So when we were confronted, as we prepared our first campaign plan in August of 2004, with the requirement by the United Nations to have elections in January 2005. We set as a goal for ourselves to have the Iraqis maintain security for those elections, and every Iraqi who wanted to vote, voted. When we set that objective, I didn't have the slightest idea whether we could do that. I hope we could, but it was a marker on the wall for us all to work for. Well, as it turned out, we did. You remember the Purple Fingers? The Purple Finger election in Iraq? Some of you might have been there. That culminated 5 months of work. And when that happened, everybody kind of looked at themselves and said, we can do this. We set a goal for ourselves, we worked for it, we achieved it, and it instilled confidence in the organization. The confidence to succeed in this hugely uncertain world. Complexity. The complexity of what's going on in Iraq is mind-boggling, but no matter what you're doing, there's so much information available that everything becomes hugely complex. And so, what do you do about it? What I found was people would zoom in to try to understand all the complexity, but they'd never zoom out. And if they didn't zoom out, they tried to do everything. And you know, when you try to do everything, you do nothing. And so they had to zoom in to understand it, then they had to zoom out to simplify it. And what I found as the four-star in Iraq and as the Chief of Staff of the Army, if I couldn't clearly communicate what it was I wanted folks to accomplish, it got more than garbled as it trickled its way down through the many levels of the chain of command. So the antidote to complexity is focus and simplicity. And lastly, ambiguity. You know, everybody takes the same, can take different conclusions from the same bit of data, and it won't surprise you that some people interpret the data from where they sit in the organization. And you'll see this all the time. The logistician will look at the plan from the implications it has for the logisticians. The ground commander will look at it from his perspective or her perspective. The artillery commander, the fire support commander, will look at it from their perspective. And as the leader, as the commander, you've got to take all these different views on board and together. And how do you do that? What happens when you do that is it takes time. It stretches out the time it takes to get things done. And what I would find, and I encouraged dissent, and I encouraged people to voice their opinions, but in the end I had to make a decision. And so I'd get everybody together and I'd say, okay, here's how I see the situation. It's different than you see it, and it's different than you see it, but I'm the one that has to make decisions, so I see it this way. And I did that as a way of letting everybody know why I was making the decision, but I also empowered them to come back to me and say, hey, General, I was right and you were wrong. And believe me, they love to do that. So that's one of the ways that I found with ambiguity. Deal with it, work through it patiently. The bottom line is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity all also have a cumulative effect. And they compete to impact your ability as a commander to focus. And without clear focus, there is not common purpose, and without common purpose, there is not effective execution, and in war, that's fatal. So, the last thing I'll say about this, about VUCA, is that just as I was leaving the Army in 2011, the leadership guru Jim Collins wrote a book called Great by Choice. And in the book, he talked about what he called the control-non-control paradox. I call it the VUCA paradox. And in his book, he looked at 20,400 companies over a 10-year period. And he asked the question, what is it that caused some of these companies to outperform their industry by 10 times over that period? He called them 10X companies. So out of 20,400 companies, how many do you think there were? Right, 7. 7. Now, you don't think the 20,393 other company CEOs weren't out there trying to succeed? Yet it was these 7 that accepted the VUCA paradox, which is you accept the fact that your environment is going to be VUCA, but you don't accept the fact that external events will determine your results. Right? Can we sign up for that right now? Again, that's your world. The world's going to be like that, but don't sign up to the fact that external events will impact your results. And I will tell you what I see in business all the time. Everybody sits around and looks at the quarterly reports, and they never make them. And they always have all these excuses why they didn't make it, but it's going to be okay the next quarter. Guess what? It ain't. So you have to make sure that you impose the systems and the vision and the strategy that allows you to achieve your results. You want to be one of the 7, not one of the 20,000. Okay? So VUCA and its impact on leaders. When I came back from Iraq, I had probably 500,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines rotate through Iraq while I was there. And so I saw a lot of leaders. And one of the first things that I had to do when I came back from Iraq was to work with the Secretary of the Army and write the guidance to the Brigadier General Board. I mean, there's about 300 plus active duty generals and about 300 plus reserve and guard generals in the Army. That's a lot of generals. But we had to write this stuff, and what I realized was that after everything I saw in Iraq, that to succeed today in a VUCA world, we need men and women with vision, courage, and character. We need men and women who see opportunities where others only see challenges. We need men and women who have the courage to act with conviction in the face of uncertainty and risk. And we need men and women with the character to do the right thing for the organization in difficult times and to bounce back when things don't go the way they want. And I will tell you, I never met a bad leader in a military school or in an officers club bar. Right? There's no pressure. Your mettle as a leader is tested when things get tough. And everything you do prepares yourself for that time. Let me just say a few words about each of those. First of all, vision. For me, especially in the VUCA world, the primary function of a leader is to point the way ahead. You're the one that's got to look at this morass of confusion out there and say, no, this is what we're going to do. And that is really hard. And what I found is the higher I got, the more complex the issues became and the harder it was for me to get clear in my own mind what was going on, let alone articulate a clear way ahead. But I had to do it. The number one question I asked in Iraq and the number one question that I continue to ask as the Chief of Staff of the Army, and I would suggest to you it's the number one question that you could ask in Lieutenant Colonel level command, is no kidding, troops, what are we really trying to accomplish? And as I said, it sounds like an easy question. But the higher I got, the harder it was to answer clearly and succinctly. Yet the more important it was that I answered it clearly and succinctly. So I spent a lot of time trying to work on a vision. Now, let me just give you a quick example here about crafting the Army vision. So I had about 60 days from the time I left Iraq to the time I took over as Chief of Staff of the Army. So I did what everybody does. You put together a transition team. I had a couple of generals in charge. I give them some guidance. I said, one, go look at what's going on inside the Army, and two, look at what's going on outside the Army. And they diligently did their work. I interacted with them. I came back, and right before I took over, 2 days before I took over, they briefed me. And they said, General, here's your vision that we think you should have for the Army. America's Army, an agile, disciplined warrior team, dominant across the spectrum of 21st century combat. Rawr. And I kind of went, huh? Man, to me, that looks like something that's on a poster in somebody's waiting room. And I didn't have conviction about it. And it was important that I have conviction about it because I had to drive it into an organization of 1 million people. And I realized that I just wasn't there yet. And so my wife and I embarked on about a 4-month journey around the Army, talking to people from every level of the Army. And what I found was an Army that was stretched by then 6 years at war and looking at another 5 or 10 of continuous deployments. We were deployment at 1 year out, 1 year back. Absolutely unsupportable. At that time, we'd lost about 3,000 soldiers, and they left about 10,000 surviving family members. We had about 25,000 wounded, 5,000 of them seriously enough to require long-term care, and we were just beginning to come to grips with the impact of post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. And the press and the Congress was saying the Army's hollow, the Army's broken, the Army's not ready. And I would tell you that this magnificent volunteer force that we've all built since the 70s on the Army side was perilously stretched. So I began describing to my key subordinates and staff how I saw things, and we had an interaction. And they helped me sharpen my thinking. I came to see the Army as out of balance, so weighed down by our current commitments that we couldn't do the things we knew we needed to do to take care of soldiers and families and prepare for the future. And as I thought about this and talked to people, that became the vision statement. Put the Army back in balance. Clear, simple, and for the next 4 years, every place I went, inside the Army, up on the Hill, outside the Army, it was put the Army back in balance. Now, that didn't happen, that didn't make things happen all by itself. It was the start. You can imagine we had a huge programmatic plan that was all behind that. But 4 years later, the Army was in a fundamentally different and better place. And it all, in my mind, it all started with the vision. Courage. We all agree that we can't predict the future. That means that anytime you're making a decision as a leader, you're making a decision about the future. What did Yogi Berra say? God rest his soul. Predictions are hard, especially when you're talking about the future. Anytime you make a decision, you're accepting risk, and nothing good happens without risk. You could be wrong, and there could be significant consequences. And the risk and the impact of wrong decisions only gets higher as you go on your way up the ranks. So it takes courage to act in the face of uncertainty and risk. And to succeed today, you have to act. And that's why I think courage is so important. Lastly, character. Leaders with strong values build strong organizations, period. In the Army, from the day a soldier walks in the door, the 7 Army values are instilled in them: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Every officer and soldier knows that they're held accountable to those standards. There's an old, one of my predecessors as Army Chief of Staff, Creighton Abrams, used to say, the higher up the flagpole you go, the more your ass hangs out. This crusty old tanker, what he meant by that is, the higher you go, more people are watching you. And if you're not living the values you espouse, the only one that doesn't know it is you, because everybody else sees it. Think about the people that have led you. Think about the people that weren't living the values that they were espousing to you. You knew it, and you probably thought less of them. In the Cornell class, I make them read 9 pages of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It's his payback because the Jesuits made me do it in Georgetown. What's he say? Here's one of the greatest philosophers in the Western world, writing 2,300 years ago. What's he say about good character? It's hard to be good. No kidding, that's what he says. It's hard to be good. He says moral goodness is a function of habit. You become a good person by habitually doing good things. Flip it over. You become a bad person by habitually cutting corners. And what I found as I look back over my career, that there were things that happened to me as a younger officer that, looking backward, were absolutely inconsequential. But I got in the habit of doing the right thing for the organization and not myself. And I'm going to tell you a quick story. I'm already a little bit over the time, but I'll just quick story. And this is, I think, is relevant to you because it's about squadron level command, lieutenant colonel level command. So I take over on Wednesday, and on Friday, the commanding general, 2-star, puts out a letter to everybody saying, we have too many security violations in Fort Carson. Pull up your socks or heads will roll. Okay? That Friday, my communications officer is doing what communications officers do once a month, destroying codes. And what do? They take a garbage can, they put a plastic bag in it, they throw the codes to be destroyed in the garbage can, they pick up the plastic bag, take it to the shredder, and it's gone, right? So he's doing this. What happens on Friday afternoon in the office? The troops take out the trash, right? He turns his head, trash, codes, in the plastic bag, into the dumpster. No problem. That dumpster's never emptied on time, except for that Friday afternoon. So now, Friday night, we got 2 companies of folks with Jeeps out there with the headlights on, and these kids are tromping all over the landfill trying to find codes, and we find about 3/4 of them. So Friday evening late, Casey's writing a note to the commanding general, right? 3 days in command, thinking my career's over, write my note. Sorry, sir, this will never happen again. Fast forward a month. Stick with me on this, you'll get it. Fast forward a month. I'm going off to Europe with my intelligence officer and my operations officer on kind of a boondoggle to look at our pre-position equipment sites. Unbeknownst to me, the intelligence officer goes to the vault, picks up classified maps, and leaves the vault open. So we go have a fine time on our trip. We come back. The first day I'm back, the XO comes in and closes the door. Note to self, when the XO comes in and closes the door, it's not going to be good news. He says, the 2 left the vault open. I said, okay, what did you do? He said, well, I got with the brigade XO and we squashed it. And I reached over and I picked up the phone and I dialed my boss and I said, Casey here, another security violation, more to follow. And I hung up. And at the time I did that because I knew that if I didn't do the right thing, within days everybody in that battalion would know that when the going got tough, you couldn't count on Casey to do the right thing. He'd cover his ass. Now, as I've looked back at it from hindsight, one of the things that I realized is when I'm confronted with a tough ethical decision, I usually know what the right thing to do is right off the bat. But the longer I have time to think about it, the harder it is. Because you start weaseling it. Anyway, I got in the habit at an early age. I mean, looking back, that was inconsequential. But I got in the habit at an early age of doing the right thing. And when times came to disagree, to do hard things like disagree with the president, and I had a lot of time to think about it, I was able to, in my mind, do the right thing. Okay? So, leaders today, vision, courage, character to succeed in a VUCA world. I am going to stop right there because I promised you some time for questions.